This is a story about death. From 1938 to 1945, thousands of Austrians were executed. Some were political prisoners, others were petty criminals, and still more were disabled children. Their bodies were given to medical schools, where doctors and students pored over the inner workings of their every organ. This is a story about ambition. Around the same time, a team of Nazi artists and dissectors were working on one of the most comprehensive anatomy textbooks of all time, using some of those same bodies. It's called the Pernkopf Atlas, and its illustrations were so detailed that some surgeons consider them the best that have ever been created, and still use them today. This is a story about medicine. The anatomical work of the Pernkopf team was built on a foundation, centuries old, crafted brick by brick with the exploitation of the vulnerable. This rotten foundation stretches as far back as the 1200s, when anatomists revived an old practice that had previously long been seen as gauche, base, and unclean. The careful practice of dissecting human cadavers to study them, to break apart the human form in order to learn how to piece it back together again. The art of cutting open one person in order to heal another. And yet, those being cut open almost never had a choice. This is a story about power. It's a story about anatomy and humanity, and what we do at a crossroads, the lengths to which we have gone to understand our own bodies, and the things that we have sacrificed along the way. Most of all, it's a story about a book that may be the most heinous volume in the history of anatomy, but is also one of the field's crowning achievements. A book born of brutality and exploitation that now has the power to heal and make whole. And in its pages, a question: what do we do with the fruits of such poisonous trees? Content warning. We're going to discuss a lot of difficult topics in this video, and to do so, we'll be showing illustrations of human remains, including some images from the Pernkopf Atlas. There will be an on-screen warning ahead of these images, and we will include time codes to skip in the video description. All anatomical props used in this video are replicas. It's been said that if Edward Pernkopf had one love, it was medicine, and if he had a second love, it was the Nazi Party. Pernkopf was born in Austria in 1888, the son of a doctor. When his father died, Edward took up the family trade, receiving his medical degree in 1912. Pernkopf was a hardcore German nationalist, even in his university days. He joined the Student Academic Fraternity of Germany, a nationalistic political organization that favored a unified German state. So he really hit the ground running on the hard nationalist ideology thing. He started teaching anatomy immediately after graduation, stopping briefly to serve as a field medic during World War I. And he was a big shot on campus well before he created one of the most influential anatomy textbooks of all time. He was promoted to associate professor at the University of Vienna in 1926, and just 7 years later, he was named director of the Anatomy Institute. In that same year, he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known by their other name, the Nazis. Then, in 1934, he joined the Sturmabteilung, aka the Browncoats, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, which, by the way, was still illegal in Austria at the time. Not only did he subscribe to some of the worst ideas in history, he was an early adopter. His hard-right allegiances didn't turn out to be a problem for his career, though. Mere days after Hitler and the Nazis invaded Austria in 1938, Pernkopf became the dean of the medical school. Once he had that power, he did what any other fascist would do. He forced all faculty to declare loyalty to Hitler and state on the record whether they were Aryan or non-Aryan. Married faculty needed their spouses to do the same. Anyone who refused was fired, and a new law banned Jewish people or those married to Jewish people from any civil service jobs, forcing them into early retirement. Pernkopf's impassioned speeches, adherence to Nazi regulations, and all-out zeal for fascism were probably major reasons that he was eventually named dean of the entire university in 1943. But all the while, as his early career progressed, he was also working on a manual for his students to aid them in their dissections. And it was this manual that would grow and become the book we're discussing today. The book's full title in English is The Atlas of Topographical and Applied Human Anatomy, but most simply call it the Pernkopf Atlas. It's a massive compendium of anatomical drawings so finely detailed that a recent survey of nerve surgeons found that 59% of them were aware of it and 13% currently use it, though there's been decades of debate over whether that's morally acceptable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. After all, Pernkopf wasn't the first to use dubious means to try to understand the human body. Just like the story of the Pernkopf Atlas, the history of anatomy is a tale of power and abuse, all the way back to the very beginning. To practice medicine, we need to understand the human body. To understand the human body, we need to look inside it. And to do that, we need bodies. Some of the oldest and most iconic historical records of human dissection go back to the Egyptians. Their famed mummy-making mortuary practices required enough knowledge of the body to disassemble it, preserve it, and prepare the deceased for the afterlife. Skilled artisans would take the body, remove pieces bit by bit, and carefully preserve them for the next world. To do so required some knowledge of what was in there, but it was largely divorced from the reality of what each body part really did, or even where it was precisely. How much knowledge they had is hard to say, because we don't find many written records from the embalmer's perspectives. And there's basically nothing written down about the surgical parts of mummification. Some researchers think that embalming was too taboo to talk about, or that the families tasked with caring for the dead had trade secrets to protect. But either way, you can't really know what the embalmers knew, only what they did with human remains. Also, the corpses on their tables were people who'd had the wealth and status to earn the fancy burials. Cutting them open was an act of respect, reverence even, for the person being dissected. This may have been the last time that was the case. From here on in our story, when humans are dissecting other humans, there's not going to be a lot of care or compassion for the person on the table. To get into all the gory details about Pernkopf and beyond, we spoke to Sabine Hildebrand, a professor of anatomy at Harvard Medical School. And to tell the story, she takes it back thousands of years to ancient Greece.
If we're talking about the first scholarly explorations in anatomy, we probably have to look at the Alexandrian time, 300 before Common Era, and there we have the first governments that allowed the use of human bodies. There's always been a tension in terms of scholars wanting to gain anatomical knowledge and societies that would allow or disallow the use of human bodies for such knowledge gain. And usually this permission by society was given through governments. And so in Alexandria, we see that for the first time, where there was a government that allowed anatomists to use human bodies for dissection.
So the ancient Greeks were among the first to investigate human anatomy in order to treat other living people's ailments, at least according to the records we have today. The first anatomist confirmed to have used human cadavers for dissection and study was Herophilus, who found that the brain was the epicenter of our intelligence, not the heart as Aristotle claimed. He was also accused of dissecting criminals while they were still alive, so mixed legacy there. The fact that the subjects of these alleged live dissections were criminals speaks to the tension that Hildebrand was talking about, which is going to carry all the way through to the present day. As laws changed around whose bodies could be used for scientific progress, well, they were rarely putting powerful people on the table, metaphorically or literally. Historically disenfranchised populations, like the poor and criminals, were usually the targets, and defining what makes someone a criminal can be pretty flexible. But it wasn't always considered cool to dissect humans, even after the Greeks had done it first. For instance, in ancient Rome, human dissection was completely illegal, so any knowledge of anatomy came from animal studies and what could be learned from treating injured gladiators. The earliest surviving anatomical text comes from China. The Mwangdu scripts, which date to sometime before 160 BCE, include a diagram of an artery stretching down a standing figure's arm, and are thought to be the scientific basis that would give rise to some traditional practices like acupuncture. Meanwhile, the anatomists of the the Islamic Golden Age made their own anatomical and medical discoveries, but there's debate among modern scholars as to whether they did so by dissecting any humans as well. Some have argued that dissection would have been forbidden by Islamic law, but others disagree, saying that there's no clear evidence of whether those laws existed. It's also been proposed that if the Islamic scholars were using cadavers, they were treating them with more respect than their European counterparts. While we're going to focus mostly on the European tradition today, we absolutely want to recognize that the Islamic and Chinese scholars were doing really important work. Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina were a big deal for European medicine. On the other hand, the Mwangdu scripts weren't influencing early European medical thought. They were only discovered during an excavation in 1973, so literally nobody knew about them until those archaeologists dug them up. Since Pernkopf exists in the context of European research, we'll stick to the social and historical forces that shape that. This is also where I want to point out a shift, one that we'll see persist through to the present day. When the body becomes a tool for knowledge, we care a bit less about where that tool came from or how it reached the dissector's table. Now, over the centuries, societies had varying ideas about just how ethical it would be to dissect people, so the progress of anatomical research kind of happened in fits and starts. We're going to fast forward a few hundred years and get to when human anatomy comes into vogue and stays there. By the 13th century CE, the University of Bologna in Italy had expanded their coursework to include medicine, which also likely meant they conducted postmortems on the deceased. Enter Mondino de Luzzi, a physician and professor. De Luzzi was the first person known to incorporate dissections of human remains into the curriculum of a medical school, and he conducted them in public. His first, which was carried out in 1315, was likely done on the body of a woman who'd been charged with an unknown crime and executed. According to one source, De Luzzi was allowed to select the means of execution. He wanted to study her anatomy after all, so would need to inform the executioner what structures to preserve. De Luzzi also wrote what some consider to be the first textbook on dissections, Anatomia corporis humani, which was used in medical schools for more than 250 years. At his public dissections, which were as much spectacle as seminar, he sat above the dissectors, reading aloud from his manual or some other anatomy text. But while Anatomia was used as a primary text for students for centuries, it did not include any illustrations. Various editions over the centuries contained mostly artistic renderings of what a dissection party looked like, but with little regard to what the anatomy showed. The earliest collection of modern anatomical drawings is likely De Humani Corporis Fabrica, created by the Flemish physician Vesalius in 1543, where De Luzzi's Anatomia was primarily text, with the engravings added in the reprinting years later. Vesalius created visual depictions of the inner workings of the human body, with the cadavers often posed in lifelike stances. And pretty much all of these bodies were straight up stolen. He was known to brag about heists for cadavers, gleefully recounting the tale of sneaking a woman's body out of its tomb and taking it to the dissection hall. When a monk reported her body missing, Vesalius and his students removed the woman's skin so she wouldn't be recognized. Furthermore, all of his dissections were open to the public and have been described as a form of theater, with Vesalius taking on the role of both anatomist and performer. If the dissections were to be public, they ought to be entertaining after all. And it's around this time that anatomy became a field of study, not just for doctors, but for artists too. Renaissance artists wanted to study human anatomy to better their art, and conducted illicit dissections of criminal bodies to do so. It's likely that Da Vinci and Michelangelo studied the human form from cadavers, which helped them render it in more lifelike detail. Plus, with the printing press, everything we learned about human anatomy could be spread around the world in as vivid detail as the writers could produce. Anatomists now needed to be skilled at dissection, description, and art. As our understanding of medicine grew, it became more and more important for doctors to study human anatomy. And like I said, to do that, you need bodies. So as we head from the 17th century onward, there's more and more pressure on the supply chain of cadavers.
Anatomy and anatomical knowledge gain always lives in this tension, as I said before, and anatomists always pushed for more bodies for their anatomical knowledge gain. And so we see in the 16th, 17th century then laws emerging throughout Europe at the time, and also starting then in the United States, that the anatomists were allowed through laws to use bodies of the impoverished or so-called unclaimed bodies of persons who died in public institutions and were not claimed for burial by their families. So that we get the very first laws of such a kind in the 16th, 17th century. There were also always the use of bodies of the executed. However, that was never enough.
A big part of this tension comes from the attitudes about dissection itself. It was seen as so repulsive, so debasing, that many anatomists longed for a better solution. Some even turned to anatomical models made of wax, crafted to be interactive, dissectable, and also works of art. These models primarily took the form of women, always beautiful and often pregnant. And yet, even with the creation of these anatomical models, the need for real, once-living bodies remained. It was exceptionally rare to find someone who'd be willing to let their body get cut open after they died, so the dissectors didn't bother to look for anybody willing. Institutions that wanted to procure bodies targeted two main groups: poor people and criminals. When people died in poorhouses or their bodies were unclaimed, anatomists were permitted to use their bodies for dissection, and the same was true of those charged with capital offenses. With these supplies limited, there weren't enough bodies to satisfy anatomists' hungry minds. To be clear, this wasn't just a problem because the anatomists would be bored or something. We still knew so little about how the human body worked, and every generation of doctors was making bigger discoveries, learning things that moved the field of medicine forward. These doctors had to know how bodies work so they could, be doctors. French doctor Jean-Louis Petit developed a version of the tourniquet in 1718, and later made innovations in the surgical treatment of breast cancer. He knew to amputate the affected breast and the swollen lymph nodes around it to prevent the cancer spread. And he couldn't have known to do that if previous anatomists had never discovered what lymph nodes were and where they were. But every discovery needs an educated doctor, and to learn, medical students needed to cut. The English government attempted to solve this problem with the 1752 Murder Act, which amended the sentence for a murder conviction to be death by hanging, followed by dissection. This was meant to aid the anatomists and to deter crime, since nobody wanted their remains to be so cruelly cut open. One of the people put to death under the act was Edith Morey. On August 21st, 1812, in the Shire Hall of Chester Castle in England, Edith was tried and convicted of murdering her husband, though her lover was the one who held the knife. Both she and her lover were put to death, and then cut open for study. Their hangings and their dissections were open to the public. This was separated into two different cuttings. First came the anatomization, in which the coroner would cut the chest open to verify that the person was dead. Seems like that would have been pretty obvious, but okay. They checked that the heart, lungs, and brain were all no longer functioning. Only then did the dissection begin. This is where Edith Morey's story began and ended. Although, after she was sentenced, Edith's death had been delayed by a few months. She was pregnant, and so her punishment was delayed until her baby was born. Her children were then left motherless, and all but the infant were likely sent to the poorhouses. More unnamed victims of the Murder Act. Over the 80 years that the law was on the books, 1,166 people were sentenced to die and be dissected. This still wasn't enough to meet the demands from both anatomists and medical students, since dissection was becoming more integral to their education too. So to supply enough corpses, bodies were stolen from graveyards. Time after time, the remains used in the pursuit of anatomical knowledge were of those who were societally disenfranchised. Their bodies were not their own. In Oxford, it was reported that the loved ones of those executed would sometimes fight the body dealers to try to preserve their family members' remains. And I wish I could say the worst was over, but an equally ugly law was on the way. The Anatomy Act of 1832 allowed poorhouses to sell the unclaimed bodies of the poor to anatomists to recoup the financial losses of caring for these people. Not that that care was, very good. The punishment for poverty would last for decades, in some cases centuries. Whether by poverty or by law, these people's agency in the treatment of their remains was robbed from them. Even worse, some of the remains of people dissected under these laws are on display in museums today, still witnessed daily by members of the public hundreds of years later. How might these people have felt about their fate? Could the powerful people who created this system have anticipated that the punishment would last this long? Would they even care? When Edward Pernkopf became a professor in 1926, he didn't set out to create one of the most infamous books of anatomy the world had ever seen. His atlas had much humbler beginnings. The book started as a manual for his students to use in their dissections. It was largely instructional with some sketches and figures to demonstrate techniques. But the manual became incredibly popular among the medical community, even outside of his own students. So popular that a publishing house in Vienna called Urban and Schwarzenberg heard about it. In 1933, they offered Pernkopf a contract to produce a 3-volume anatomy atlas based on his dissection manual, and this project would consume him for the rest of his life. The first volume of the atlas was published in 1937, before Austria was annexed to Germany. Volumes 2 and 3 came out in 1941 and 1952, and the final volume was published in 2 parts in 1960, after Pernkopf's death. Pernkopf was a skilled anatomist and dissector, but he wasn't an artist. So in the creation of this manual of anatomy, he hired a team of illustrators to render his dissections in paint and ink. The first to come on board was Eric Lapierre, who was the only member of the illustrative team not to have formal training in art. He soon became the de facto leader of the illustration team. The atlas took over 30 years to complete, so the full roster of illustrators wasn't the same from start to end. But the most prolific members of the illustration team were Lapierre, Ludwig Schrott, Karl Entresser, and Franz Böttke. These artists were true masters of their craft, managing to render lifelike details of the human body in glowing watercolors. For instance, Lapierre used many techniques similar to those of the Dutch Golden Age painters, and even treated his paper with bile to help it absorb the colors better, without smudging. The rest of the team followed his lead on the bile paper, all of which meant they could achieve crisp details needed for things like veins, nerves, and the many textures of tissue under our skin. The combination of beauty and accuracy is captivating, especially to other anatomists.
I saw that for the first time when I was a graduate student in the University of Cincinnati School of Medicine, and my professor had gone out and bought this atlas, and that was in 1968. So I remember taking one of the copies, one of the volumes, into my office in the Department of Surgery and looking at it and just being almost mesmerized by these incredibly beautiful paintings.
That's David Williams, a retired professor of medical art from Purdue University and scholar of the Pernkopf Atlas. For Williams, the allure of the artistry of this book was immediate.
And that fascination just stayed with me through a long, somewhat torturous path that took me eventually to Vienna and then to Innsbruck, where I was able to live with and study with the last painter who had contributed to this atlas.
He's referring to Böttke, who lived until 1983 and enjoyed a quiet career to his final days, spending most of his time in seclusion painting. Williams saw Böttke as one of the most talented painters who worked on the book, so much so that he went to study under him briefly in the 1970s.
I met Franz Böttke at the Anatomy Institute at the University of Innsbruck. And he had, in my opinion, he had sort of imprisoned himself in the Anatomy Institute. He had a place that was given to him or provided to him in the Anatomy Institute that consisted of a very rudimentary bedroom. He had a bathroom, and then he had a room that was sort of it was a studio area. I tried to tell him that I'd come to meet him and to learn how he had made these gorgeous paintings. And it was really that simple. At that time, I really didn't know the history behind the work. I didn't know that he had been a Nazi. I just really admired his painting technique and wanted to learn the same technique.
So Williams wanted to study under this incredible illustrator while he was still alive, which is why... Wait, what was that about Botke being a Nazi? Yeah, turns out that Pernkopf wasn't the only big fan of fascism on this team. The reason we know this is that they drew a bunch of Nazi symbols in their signatures, which made it into the book. The most obvious examples came from Lapierre, who often signed his paintings with Lapierre Wien. Wien being the German name for Vienna, where the paintings were made. Adding the second word made it possible for Lapierre to sneak in a swastika into the space between them. He started doing so in 1937, when the Nazi Party was banned in Austria, so he had to be pretty committed to Nazism to pull such a risky move at that time. Meanwhile, Karl Entresser took advantage of the double S's in his name, turning them into SS lightning bolts. Franz Botke wasn't lucky enough to have any letters in his name that were easy to convert to Nazi symbols, but that might not have stopped him from joining in. He liked to date his paintings, and in 1944, well, a double 4 can easily become a different pair of pointed, angular symbols. Now, researchers have debated whether or not that's actually what he was doing here, but given that his 4s look different in every signature in the book that's not from 1944, well, you be the judge. Led by Pernkopf, the artist who created these images worked tirelessly, with Pernkopf himself often spending 18 hours at a time on his work. The project carried on until it was slowed down by World War II. Entresser and Schrott both became soldiers for the Nazis, and Lapierre served as an air raid warden as well. Botke even went to the front lines in Russia in 1941 and was wounded while there. Work on the Atlas reached a full standstill when the Allies defeated the Germans in 1945. Once American troops entered Vienna, they began a process of denazifying the city and its government. This involved arresting individuals who had aligned themselves with the Nazi regime and subjecting them to both hard labor and re-education. They were shown videos on the full scope of the horrors of concentration camps. They had to face the death machine they'd created and served. Pernkopf and Botke were among those arrested. The Nazis were defeated, but the rot at the heart of their ideas remained, even in the Atlas. And yet the swastikas and lightning bolts, and all the other evidence of its creator's ideals, somehow never tarnished the legacy of the book for decades. It took nearly 50 years for physicians and researchers to fully contextualize the Pernkopf Atlas for what it was. Questions started cropping up as early as the 70s, but really rose to the surface in the mid-90s, when a dentistry professor named Howard Israel received a vintage copy of the Atlas as a gift. He noticed the insignias right away, and he also observed that a man in the book was drawn with a shaved head, which was done to political prisoners at the time. Plus those swastikas and Nazi symbols that the artist drew into their signatures. Well, sometime after the first edition books were printed in the US, the publishers figured out that it was a bad look. They did their best to scrub out the most obvious swastikas from the later editions, which was why these questions only came up when people started examining the vintage copies in greater detail. Someone, somewhere along the way, had decided that it was easier to sweep the books past under the rug than to confront them for what they were. But they couldn't hide this secret forever. In March of 1995, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center called on the University of Vienna to conduct an investigation into the issue. They wanted to determine if any of the people depicted in the Atlas could be identified as Holocaust victims or at all. According to Sabina Hildebrandt and other scholars, it's unlikely that any victims of concentration or execution camps were sent to Vienna, so the images aren't of Holocaust victims per se. Instead, these Nazi artists took a page from a much older playbook.
Now, what happened under the Nazis from 1933 on was that the legislation was changed. It became much more severe, whereas in the Weimar Republic, that democratic system before 1933, we have only one reason that led to a capital punishment verdict. That was high treason and aggravated murder. Under the Nazis, we get 40 different reasons to give a person a verdict of capital punishment. That could be things like listening to enemy radio, especially during the war times. It could be speaking badly about Hitler. It could be stealing from a bombing site. It could be stealing packages from the mail. So all of these reasons led to an extremely high number of executions following military and civilian verdicts. So we're not talking here so much about the bodies that came from the camp systems. Those were also delivered actually to the anatomies. But we're talking here specifically about the bodies of the executed.
It was the murder act all over again, but this time on a much larger scale.
So we see, and this is a conservative estimate, an exponential rise, especially during the war years, to altogether 30,000 executions. And most of these bodies were made available to the 30 anatomical institutes that we can find in Germany and the annexed and occupied territories.
And I do want to be clear here. Pernkopf was not the only Nazi doing research on anatomy and medicine during this time. There were a lot of other doctors and scientists who chose to exploit the vulnerable people, the victims of the Holocaust death camps, and those who stood up against the Nazi regime. Pernkopf's contribution to this industry of evil stands out because, well, he wrote it all down and published it in his atlases. The University of Vienna's investigation found that at least 1,337 bodies sent there during the book's creation were Landesgericht, political prisoners sentenced to death. 7 of them were Jewish. However, they couldn't determine if any of these political prisoners' bodies were used by Pernkopf specifically, even though some of Pernkopf's former co-workers say that they were. The investigators only confirmed that the anatomy school received them for dissection, not where they went after that. This is partly because the cadavers were anonymized after reaching the medical school, and partly because the building where most of the records were kept was bombed in 1945. Still, scholars like Hildebrandt are pretty sure that whatever the number of Landesgericht may be, it's not low.
And then we also know, and this is from newer research that we were able to glean from witness interviews at the time, is that it is highly likely that hundreds of these bodies were used for those images that were created during the war period, and possibly even after, because we know that some of the bodies of the victims also remained at the Vienna Institute after the war. That's often a forgotten fact, but especially the head and neck volumes might still have actually images based on bodies of Nazi victims.
That said, we don't know if every image was based on these executed people. Remember, volumes 3 and 4 came out in 1952 and 1960 respectively, well after World War II was over. Plenty of paintings were made well after the Nazi regime was dismantled, but it's a question of whether they got new bodies in after that, or kept using the ones they had. The records and original paintings for the atlas that still exists were donated to the Josephina Medical History Museum in Vienna. The original publishing company for the atlas, Urban & Schwarzenberg, was acquired in 2003 by the academic publishing house Elsevier. Urban & Schwarzenberg had stopped printing the atlas in the mid-90s, and Elsevier wisely decided to keep with that precedent. In 2019, Elsevier also granted the Josephina all publishing rights to the paintings, with explicit limitations on how and when they can be used. When it comes to the Pernkopf Atlas, the legacy of profiting from the exploitation of the Nazis' victims was over. Those with the power to do so were seeking to make things right. But future chapters of its story have yet to be written, and there's still plenty to discuss about what they will contain. Although it's nearly 100 years old, the Pernkopf Atlas has been described as the pinnacle of color anatomic illustration, and that made it vital in anatomy education for generations.
Those images, even though because of the political background of the atlas, the book is no longer printed, those books that are still around are still being used by some, not by many, but by some, especially by some surgeons who have essentially learned to see the human body with those images. So that's a process. Learning anatomy is very much the learning of recognition of patterns. And once you learn with us to look in a particular way, those images can help you as orientation. And that's been documented well for surgeons. It also still, especially for head and neck surgeons, is still a favorite for students.
Basically, if you use Pernkopf to learn anatomy the first time, it shapes how you think of the body forever. There's also a sort of artistry to the approach that both Pernkopf and the illustration team took when it came to depicting the layers of tissue. Our bodies are three-dimensional objects, and displaying that in two dimensions is a challenge. The Pernkopf Atlas often shows the same part of the body dissected in these layers, moving from superficial to deep. This means that you can easily infer the pieces of the body that lie on top or underneath and get around that 2D problem.
What he brought together was a topographical approach. That means that you show the human body region by region, and you also go from superficial to deep. So in layers. He was very, very thorough. So we have here one of the most detailed atlases, and he probably copied some of the best atlases that already existed at the time.
Part of what made the book so striking was really just a lucky coincidence. See, the first edition of the book came out just after a new printing technique was invented that allowed for the layering of colors, which gives the watercolors in Pernkopf an almost luminous quality.
And used then at a technique that was at the time new, a 4-color printing technique that allowed for a much more differentiated color palette on these images, so that very clearly these images stood out from anything that had ever been produced before.
All in all, this combination of impeccable artistry and immaculate detail made Pernkopf the gold standard of all anatomical texts for decades.
And he had a very particular view for detail, so this particular atlas gives you much more detail, especially in certain regions. So peripheral nerve surgeons, for example, see more than they see in any other general atlas. The head and neck surgeons see much more than they see in any other atlas. So he basically created an atlas that served as an all-round information of the highest detail.
Although in a somewhat ironic twist, the contributions that Pernkopf made in his own hand, the descriptions of what the images show, are some of the least interesting parts of the whole thing.
And specifically, the German originals are actually pretty tedious to read. It's about 7 big books like this. Enormous, because he was actually obsessive compulsive in his writing. So that for the popular English version of the atlas, only the image plates were used and the legends, and not the text. The text is basically unreadable, even for a specialist. You wouldn't want to read all that detail that he put in that book. But the plates are still being used.
At least used by some. As you can imagine, not everyone agrees on whether anyone should be using this book at all, whether to study or to do surgery. So if using this book is the difference between success and failure, and using it is the only path towards helping people today, does that make it worth using? Well, not everyone agrees. But for people like Rabbi Joseph Polak, there's a pretty clear answer. Polak has studied the ethical handling of Holocaust-era human remains in accordance with Jewish law, and even created the Vienna Protocol, a series of guidelines for archaeologists to follow. The protocol is pretty straightforward. There must be an effort to identify the remains, inform any next of kin, and the remains should be either transferred to their descendants or reburied promptly. But this doesn't address how we reckon with human remains that only exist as ink and paper, as images divorced from their names. Which is why a surgeon named Susan McKinnon reached out to Rabbi Polak to ask for his thoughts.
Susan McKinnon phones me up somewhere in the last 10 years. She doesn't know me from a hole in the wall. And she says, you're the author of the Vienna Protocol, right? I said, yeah, I'm the author of the Vienna Protocol. I had some partners doing it, but I'm the principal author. She says, I have a question for you. She's the head of hand surgery and really that kind of surgery anywhere on the body at WashU in St. Louis. And she says she's got a patient who has excruciating pains in her knee. And the patient has said to her, either you find the nerve in my knee and take it out, or else I want you to amputate. She opens the knee. She can't find the nerve. She knew exactly what she had to do. She had an anatomy atlas in her locker that she could consult. And she was pretty sure that that would have the nerve. She called me and basically saying, is this the right thing to do?
You can guess which anatomy atlas that was. See, Pernkopf is especially noteworthy for the level of detail in the nervous system, particularly the peripheral nerves. Nerves are tricky, and even an incredibly skilled surgeon might struggle to find them amongst all the other soft tissue. And since nerves are hard to repair, it's vital that you can identify exactly what you're looking at so you don't make the wrong cut. Which explains why some doctors might need to consult an atlas to find the correct structure to do as little damage as possible to the surrounding tissue, which is why they need Pernkopf.
So I said to her, it is absolutely the right thing to do. If you can take away pain from somebody and heal them by looking at this atlas, you are giving meaning to the murders of all the peoples whose body parts are displayed in the atlas. But more than that, in Jewish law, we are not permitted to benefit from remains. So you would think that there is a conflict, but there isn't a conflict, because we're talking about benefiting from remains and not drawings of remains. In other words, if she had body parts there and would want to go, that would be a much higher level question in Jewish law. But it isn't. But I said, there is one thing you have to do, and that's part of the Vienna Protocol. And that is, you have to tell everybody what you're doing, what you're consulting, and is it okay with them? And she went to the family, and she went to this woman and said, I'm going to go to my locker, I'm going to look it up, but I need you to understand what it is, what I'm doing, and are you okay with it? And of course, everybody was okay with it.
After consulting the atlas, McKinnon completed the surgery and her patient was relieved of their debilitating pain. For Polak, the biggest factor in all this is informed consent. Just like a patient needs to be told about everything that'll happen to them during a procedure, they need to know if their surgeon is consulting this book and its history. This allows everyone to pay their respects to those victims who never wanted to be immortalized on paper, let alone by such evil people, which is also why so many people refuse to use the book at all.
I think my sense of speaking to doctors that have gone to it is that it's terrific, but it's like I don't want to touch it because it's grubby. That's the sense that they had. They don't want it. They don't want it. And we're waiting for something better to come along.
And no, we're not there yet. Despite all the fancy imaging technology we have, most anatomists and doctors still rely on the work of medical illustrators, which might surprise you if you're not trained in any of those fields. We have everything from X-rays and MRIs to 3D scanners and just plain old photographs. Surely looking at the real thing as it appears in real life is better and more accurate than some doodle. How could a drawing possibly be better than the finest imaging technology science can invent? To get to the bottom of that question, we spoke with Leah Leibowitz, the director of the Biomedical Visualization Program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She talked with us about the vital role that medical illustration can play in education, both for doctors and patients.
Medical illustration plays such a fundamental role in education, and it really comes back to how we clarify what's going on that might be really complex and hard to understand. So images exist, right, and photos and scans, and you can say, well, what's the need for medical illustration when you can just go take a photo of something or, take an image or a scan of something and use that to learn. And that's true, that can be very meaningful and you can take information from that, but it's not being curated. It's not being able to clarify certain pieces that may be very difficult to understand. Think about a surgical field. Taking an image that might be going on during a surgery could be very complex and hard to kind of understand what's actually going on in the anatomy. And our role as biomedical visualizers is really to come in and clarify and understand, okay, who is our audience? What do they need to know to be able to kind of get to the next step, to deeper their understanding or deeper their learning? And we can help clarify that by building in connections, understanding someone's pre-knowledge, and creating visuals that really meet someone where they are to deepen that understanding.
Part of the medical illustrator's job is not just deciding what to depict, but how to show it. And figuring that out means deciding who your final illustration is really for. For medical professionals, this usually means finding ways to emphasize the 3D nature of the body. Pernkopf accomplished this with those superficial to deep image series that I mentioned earlier, along with a few other techniques. In some cases, they'd paint some body parts so they looked translucent, meaning that everything underneath was clear to see. Another technique was so popular that it's influenced a lot of medical illustrations since then: color coding. It's now commonplace that anatomy diagrams draw arteries in red, veins in blue, and nerves in yellow. While Pernkopf might not be the first to do this, some of the most striking images in the whole atlas are those that depict incredible networks of branching vessels rendered in shimmering reds and blues. It's hard to imagine that these images didn't have a major influence on the style preferences of future medical illustrators. Because Pernkopf has been held up as a pinnacle of anatomy for so long, it's impossible to deny that the book influenced a lot of how anatomy is drawn, even today. Fortunately, programs like the one at University of Illinois at Chicago work to make their students aware of these problems.
So I think especially with the Pernkopf Atlas, it's very much known for its technically beautiful illustrations, right? It's always been looked at, in addition to the ethical concerns that it has, but it's always been looked at of like, oh, this is a beautiful way of rendering tissue and, arteries and vessels. And so very an old school medical illustration, I think it was always very much revered of like, oh, this is the standard, the ideal, and people learn from that. And so I think you'll see sometimes where older medical illustration just keeps getting published, even though there might be concerns and problems with it, but it becomes like, well, that was the gold standard. And we need to really question like, well, why is that the gold standard? Is it just a really beautifully rendered piece? But we can't ignore all the other things that we really have to consider, right? Those ethical concerns. But in addition, diverse body types and being inclusive to the bodies and anatomy that we see, and making sure that we're really training future clinicians to be as prepared to work with no matter, body size, shape, no matter who they might be encountering.
So while illustrators can appreciate the skill and artistry of this atlas, there's a desire to think about new ways to approach anatomical illustrations. We want to close the book on Pernkopf, but doing so requires us to think entirely differently about how we teach and how we learn what is inside our bodies. The Pernkopf Atlas hasn't been in print for decades, and likely never will be again. The only sales of Pernkopf copies occur on secondhand reseller sites like eBay, where a complete copy in good condition can fetch hundreds or even thousands of dollars. There are also scans of the atlas online, and anyone who chooses to reference them can do the research to find out the book's uncomfortable history. And critically, the word is out about that history, meaning that doctors and anatomists who do use it can warn their colleagues and pay their respects to the victims depicted in its pages. But this may not be the end of the atlas. Like I said, the illustrations are online, and when images are on the internet, they can be scraped and used to train generative AI models.
I'm already seeing the first AI-generated images that clearly have used the Pernkopf Atlas without any clue by the user of the atlas or the creator of the image with the AI model that they've been using the Pernkopf Atlas and what the Pernkopf Atlas is.
These illustrations are living on in the AI models, entirely separate from any context or recognition of where they came from. The victims have become digital ghosts, haunting the algorithms that spit out mangled versions of their bodies. And not for nothing, but the images aren't even good.
These classical atlases have had hundreds of years of development, and I think to create a whole new set of images that show us what we need to see will take a little bit of time. And specifically as everybody is messing around with AI models currently, I mean, those images are so bad, you wouldn't believe it. They have nothing to do with accuracy, and certainly are not history informed.
It takes years or even decades to become an expert in anatomy. So when AI tries its 8-fingered hand at making anatomical diagrams, it's hardly a surprise that the images aren't going to be all that accurate. So no, AI is not going to save us from the need for Pernkopf. And that's a real shame. To think that there's simply no replacement. We've reached the pinnacle of medical illustration, and that means that we're forced to train the best of us, the healers and helpers, on a book that's the result of crimes against humanity. We're just never going to surpass Pernkopf. Except, hold on, that's a terrible attitude. I mean, says who? There's nothing stopping us from starting fresh and making a better, more ethical resource for anatomists to use today. That's where Dr. Kalyanam Shivkumar comes in. He's a physician and researcher at UCLA and has spent most of his career learning just about everything there is to know about the human heart. Shivkumar first learned of the Pernkopf Atlas, as many other scholars did, by hitting the books.
Any scholar in any field, when you start reading about a given area, you start looking into the literature, you try to see who is published in that area. So the main source was actually reading the literature, going to the library, talking to experts, reading the papers. Soon it became obvious that almost all the key anatomical works in the literature were a derivative of Pernkopf.
Shivkumar's research into Pernkopf led him to all the findings we've laid out here. But for him, knowing what Pernkopf really was only the beginning.
And the scholars there, of course, have written about it. And they decided, that they're not going to publish that work anymore. That's when I looked at it and said, okay, where does this leave us? There were two schools of thought. People said, let's just acknowledge what happened. And it is useful. In fact, when you look at very thoughtful surgeons, people have used the atlases, especially to get, the peripheral nerve anatomy, which is exquisite, which we needed. I simply, in my initial reaction, I said, okay, we just have to surpass it.
Easier said than done. Remember, the original atlas was made over the course of more than 20 years by lots of generational talents, and with essentially unlimited funding from a publisher. One of the biggest barriers to surpassing Pernkopf is just how many resources were available to the makers. They had tons of funding and support from their publisher and from the university. So it was going to take a massive amount of work to even try to match up. Work that Shivkumar was willing to put in. Thus, the Amarayad project was born.
Amarayad project was a project that it was created because of my singular desire to do something about an injustice that I had seen. I was discussing this with my colleagues here, and one of my teachers and now colleague at UCLA, Professor Barbara Natterson, I was just talking to her, and we coined the term. We're going to call it Amarayad.
Amara means immortal in Sanskrit, and Yad means hand in Hebrew. So the Amarayad project aims to become an immortal hand, forever pushing the boundaries of what researchers can understand about the human body. The hope is that the Amarayad project can produce atlases that are even better than Pernkopf.
We're going to replace these atlases and provide some of the criteria was to have it ethically sourced, the absolute best quality of information, open access, no barriers, no walls. Anyone, anywhere in the world can access this. Right this minute, a few keyboard clicks away, you can download 2 very beautiful volumes of the Atlas. It's available for the entire world. It's funded by donors, and it's funded by the taxpayers of the United States of America. So I think that is, in many ways, it's an expression of our deep desire to be of service to other human beings, as simple as that.
While that desire may be simple, the reality of making something like this is anything but. There are dozens of people across tons of specialities who all have to come together to make something like this even possible.
So, yes, it starts off with physicians, it starts off with proceduralists, surgeons, working with anatomists, PhD scientists. But we are also working with people who are digital experts, people who can capture digital information. We are working with people who actually are artists, who are able to take digital information. So now we're getting information from many different sources, but it also goes through the filter of an artist's eye. We're also working with people who teach medical ethics. We are now having some initial conversation with the Hebrew University in Israel, including our schools at Oxford Institute of Science. We are having ethicists who are working with us. So it's brought together a lot of people. Obviously, my expertise is only in some of these areas, but that's kind of what the project is. We have already planned 7 volumes of the atlas for the heart, but we're extending to other parts of the human body. And also what we're doing in this process is we are learning new ways of archiving information. We're also expanded our work to identify canonical, very critical pieces of teaching material that will inform medical practice. Instead of having to struggle with the fruit of a poisonous tree, why don't we create something new?
To many of us, Pernkopf feels different from other Nazi medical atrocities because we can see it, hold it, interact with it. This book is a physical, tangible work of devotion to both cruelty and healing, rendered in paint and ink. To tell this story, we had to grapple with that reality when we bought copies of it online. Holding these books, seeing them, it's chilling. Without context, these images can be beautiful, but once you know the history, it's impossible to overlook the fact that you're looking at the bodies of executed political prisoners. And we know we're not the right people to keep these books. There are students and scholars who'd benefit from these, which is why we're donating them to the Health Sciences Library at the University of Illinois at Chicago. They'll be sent to their rare books collection and archived with the full context of what the books are. Any researcher who checks these books out will also be given articles on their history, including a letter from the University of Vienna about its past. If there's anything we can learn from the Pernkopf Atlas, it's that we must be willing to look uncomfortable truths dead on. Scraping away the evidence of a swastika doesn't undo the fact it was drawn. Denying unsavory history does not change it into something more palatable. This was a story about death, ambition, medicine, and power. But by talking about it for what it is, we can change the story from one of evil into a story of redemption, where we learn from the sins of our past and work to do better. For everyone in the Atlas's pages, for Edith Morey, for every person whose bones are on display that did not want them there. Dig out the poison trees and grow something new.